Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Can I Have a Word, the podcast that explores language and its impact on our identity and the people we become. I'm your host, Carl James, and I'm back with another solo episode. Now, today's episode is a bit more, I'll say, challenging for me. It's a somewhat of a difficult topic, but it's something that's been on my mind for a while. And I thought that since I have this space and this platform to talk about difficult and uncomfortable things, that we would do it. So let's just dive on in. Hopefully, you're either out taking a walk or, doing something relaxing. Because I got a couple of stories. And so hopefully you'll be able to just sort of check it out and, hear what I've got to say. So with that said, here we go. Today's word is safe. Now, what do we think of when we think of safe? By definition, very simply, it can just mean being protected from or not exposed to danger or risk. Sounds real simple, real basic. We're all sort of familiar with this idea. But what happens when you are exposed to danger and or you are a witness to violence or come close to it or live with it as a constant threat in your life? Suddenly, that very simple definition kind of starts to fall apart and becomes a lot more complicated. For me, that definition of safe kind of began to unravel again not that long ago. So several months ago, you might remember here in New York, there was a mass shooting at an office building, specifically 345 Park Avenue. That just so happens to be the place where I used to work. I know that lobby, I know the hallways, and I have friends and former colleagues that are still there. And a tragedy like that is always devastating, no matter when or where it happens, but it becomes particularly destabilizing when it's a place that you've known and have some familiarity with, and it happens to people that you've worked alongside and know quite intimately. It becomes personal. And, it was all of the things that you would expect when something like that happens at a place that you kind of panic a little bit. You wonder if people got out safely. You start checking on your friends. And, so I did all of those things. And it really it was jarring in a particular kind of way. And again, I wasn't there. And so I wouldn't pretend that what I was experiencing was anything close to what people who were currently working in that building were experiencing, but it was still jarring nonetheless. And it actually reminded me of another experience that I don't ever really talk about because I think I still have somewhat complicated feelings around it. And I frame it in a very odd way, which you'll come to understand once I tell the story. And again, I don't share this story in any way to compare it to the mass shooting that took place, but it was something that reminded me of something that I had been through. And so that is why I'm sharing it now. So, story time. Back in about 2011, I was in grad school in an acting program. And as part of that program, we spent the last semester of our first year in Moscow, Russia, training with Russian actors, teachers, and, sort of learning the craft kind of in that system. And toward the end of our time there, whenever you visit a place, you want to get souvenirs. So I decided to go to this market that was just outside of, the main city center to get some souvenirs at this market. And I think if I remember correctly, I did go with people, but then we kind of split up to kind of do our own thing. Um, and so I was kind of walking around looking at the different stalls. And I'll say, this is a random aside, but it very much relates. So while I was in Russia, I obviously I kind of let my hair grow out. I like to keep my hair short. Clearly, those who are watching can see I like to keep my hair very short. And so at the end of that semester, I had not had a haircut in about 4 months. And so it was sort of maddening to me. And so I was really in need of a haircut. I happened to see an area in this market where some guys were cutting hair. And I was like, oh, that's a barbershop kind of looking setup. I was like, maybe I'll get my haircut while I'm here. So I randomly decided to go into this little corner area to see if I could get a haircut. Now, I was dressed very casually, had a pair of jeans on, a Nike zip up, and a pair of sunglasses from Target. Nothing fancy. And again, this will become relevant very shortly. So while I'm in there waiting to sort of try to figure out how to get my haircut from these Russian guys. Now, I speak conversational Russian at best, and I mean not very well at the time. So oftentimes, like me communicating with locals was a challenge. But walking into a barbershop, you kind of know how to mimic like I want a haircut. So I kind of did that. While I was waiting, there was another group of guys who were also waiting, and one of them was kind of like looking me up and down, kind of like assessing me, my outfit, etc. Now, being Black in Russia is not the norm, obviously. There are Africans there, but they are not necessarily treated the best. And so whenever I walked around, I would often get the eyes and, people kind of wondering, what am I doing there? And all of that. And by this point, it was near the end of my time, so I was very used to this. And I could tell that the guys were talking about me and looking at me. And so one of them approached me and was kind of like motioning to the sunglasses that I was wearing. It was sort of like sitting in my shirt. And in some kind of like attempt to strike up conversation, he was like, let me try, meaning he wanted to try on my sunglasses. Now, I don't know this man from Adam. And I was like, kind of trying to say no, but he motioned again and kind of insisted. He's like, no, let me try. And I was like, okay, I don't know where this is going. So maybe we just let him try the glasses and then we'll be done with it. So I let him try the glasses. Couple seconds pass by. He's just kind of like checking himself out, looking at his friends. And then at a certain point, I was like, okay, I think I'm over this. I'm ready to get my sunglasses back. So I try to get them back from him, and he says, no, I keep, meaning I'm going to keep them. I was like, well, no, I don't think that's what I signed up for. So I try again. I was like, no, just kind of give them back. And he's like, no, I keep. At that point, he opened up his jacket and there was a gun inside. Now, all sorts of things flashed in my head at that point. I was like, this can't be happening. This isn't real, right? Like, it's daylight. There are other people around. Surely he's not holding me up for these $14 Target sunglasses. Like, this can't be real. And so immediately I insisted to myself that the gun wasn't real. That may seem completely irrational, stupid even, but that is the only way my mind could make sense of what was happening. That said, I wasn't about to lay my life down for a $14 pair of sunglasses. So I was like, okay, you keep. And I started to walk out. At which point he says, no, just kid, meaning I'm just kidding. And I was like, no, you can have them. Like, we don't need to continue this interaction anymore. And he's like, no, take it back. At which point he gave me back the sunglasses. And then I immediately just hightailed it out of there. Screw the haircut. Now, I don't tell that story very often because, quite frankly, even all these years later, I'm not even exactly sure how to frame it. I just know that in that moment, I definitely didn't feel safe. because I didn't know the language. I wasn't sure what was happening. I knew what it looked like was happening, but in my mind, I still couldn't even process that it was all real. And so I share that because isn't just the absence of danger isn't the same as the presence of safety, right? And safe isn't just about your location. It's about identity. It's about perception and what you think you're allowed to feel. And I think in our society, we talk a lot about safety, but we rarely question what that means or who gets to feel it and when. And so today I want to kind of unpack this idea of what it means to be safe and, not just thinking about it in terms of your physical safety, but also emotional safety. And not just in theory, but in proximity to real harm. So, when I was growing up, safe used to mean, staying out of certain neighborhoods at certain times, like be home by 10 o'clock, be in the house, don't go to this neighborhood. That was how you could stay safe. But we've seen that, mass shootings and, things like that happen in everyday locations, whether it be office buildings, schools, grocery stores, churches, nightclubs, grocery store, every conceivable place that you would otherwise have thought was safe has had or had experienced a mass shooting. Um, so I think as a society, our concept of what a safe space is has fundamentally shifted, even though we don't necessarily acknowledge that. And if you've ever been close to a site of violence, maybe a place that you've worked at, or a place that you have ties to, it does sort of create this kind of cognitive dissonance between your past comfort and your present risk. So in the case of the office building, I'm no longer working there, but I remember exactly what it's like to be there. I've waited for government officials and celebrity guests in that lobby. I have met friends for happy hour in that lobby. I have taken elevators in all four of those elevator banks. And so even though I wasn't actually there, I can't unsee what happened there because of how proximal and how much I know about that actual space. And so one of the things that I want to share is an opinion that, some may find questionable, people may viscerally disagree with, and I get that. But in my opinion, safety is actually a social construct. I think, when we're younger, when we're taught about safety, it's, tied to neighborhoods, behaviors, and curfews, kind of like what I was just saying. Um, you know, don't drink and drive, be in the house by a certain time, avoid this neighborhood after dark. But we've seen that mass shootings have kind of really changed the idea around what safety actually means. And we often equate precautions, whether it be alarm systems, avoiding certain areas, with real protection. That's really something that we do to, manage our own perception, but it doesn't control an outcome. No amount of alarms are going to take away a real threat. And so the belief that some places are safe is kind of a psychological strategy that we all buy into, but it's not really a reliable truth because we've seen that anything can happen at any time. And so it's been a weird past few months as I've tried to reconcile this idea about what safe spaces are, because a lot of what I've been taught and what I thought I knew about what made a space safe, is actually not that true. We do the best we can to believe and create a system that seems safe, but at any time that can be destroyed, as we've seen. The other thing that I wanted to sort of touch on is this idea that status doesn't shield you from violence. Many people believe, and I will say that I kind of believed it too, is that, professional success or social standing can somehow insulate you from harm, that the right zip code or the right career will provide you sort of infinite protection because you are in a different space where those types of things don't happen. The shooting over the summer kind of obliterated all of that for me. I would have never imagined that a space that I knew and that I knew so viscerally could have ever encountered the type of violence that it did. And you think about an office building, office buildings are a collection of people across all demographics. And so status offers no immunity from that type of violence and horror. And it seems like the public response to those types of tragedies often depend on who is harmed. So if someone is, prominent or high ranking to some degree, those individuals receive more attention, disrupting the illusion that that group of people in that sort of tier are untouchable. So that really does sort of go against this idea that achievement can mask or thwart feeling unsafe. It can happen anywhere. And violence really does collapse the distance between them and us. Unfortunately, it brings us together in this really sort of horrific way. And so safety is in no way, shape, or form a reward for success. It's fragile and can be disrupted at any time. After the shooting happened, one of the things that was, I'll say, thought-provoking for me is that I heard from people that I hadn't heard from in a very long time. As a matter of fact, the person who alerted me to the shooting was someone that I used to work with years ago in the same building. She now lives on the West Coast, but she sent me a text message saying, "Carl, are you okay? I heard about the shooting. Like, just wanted to check on you." And I was like, at first I was like, "What are you talking about? I'm fine. I no longer work there." Then I turned on the news, and then of course I saw what everybody else saw. And then I started to get a couple of other reach outs from people who lived in, Chicago, and a friend from Las Vegas texted, and less so from people in New York. Now, part of that is because, some people probably knew that, I no longer worked in that building, that I, wasn't in immediate physical danger. And so there was a presumption that I was fine, which I totally get. But it did make me think about sort of who reaches out and who tries to connect with you when tragedy like this strikes. I even got an email from a good friend of mine who used to live in New York and now lives in South Korea. And that's when it really kind of hit me, like, some people really do, come out of the woodwork because of the connection that you had with them, in the sense of, like, even if you are physically okay, are you emotionally okay? Did you know anybody who was hurt? And fairly or unfairly, most would probably say unfairly, the idea of some people reaching out and some people not really made me think about, the depth and reliability of certain relationships. And again, I'll say it, I know that critique feels unfair, but when you are kind of in an emotionally vulnerable place, it was something that really kind of sat with me. And I don't bring any of this up to sit in judgment of anyone who didn't reach out to me. I'm not saying that people don't care about me, But I think what I am saying is that when these types of tragedies happen, we do sort of compartmentalize what we think we need to do based on physical harm. So, assuming that I am physically okay, one might assume that I should be completely okay. Physically, I was fine. Emotionally, I was not. And, I think I probably experienced my own version of, maybe secondary survivor's guilt. Again, I wasn't in the building, but I know people who work there. And I just felt viscerally that somehow I was connected even though I no longer worked there. And so, I wanted to share this because I think because of the normalization of mass shootings in this country, I think we've all become a bit desensitized to how awful, disruptive, painful, and emotional they can be, because oftentimes it happens in another state, in another place, a place that we'll never go, that we'll never see with our own eyes, and to a community that we'll never have any sort of real relationship with. So while it may be sad, you spend a few moments acknowledging how sad it is, how awful it is. Maybe you go on social media, throw up a hashtag, and then a day or two later, you kind of move on. And, you're fortunate if you can do that. But when that type of violence hits you personally, either because you experienced it yourself or someone it's happened to, you don't move on in the same way, and it kind of sits with you. And so I guess I'm hoping, or what I would like to believe, is that we can return to a place where we start to have a greater sense of empathy for what people might be going through, even though the harm may not be physical. Emotional scars are a thing and they do last. And again, I'm, a resilient person. I wasn't lamenting like, oh, I wish X, Y, and Z person would have reached out to me. It wasn't about that. It just made me realize that, it would have been nice to have more people do that. And quite frankly, I could probably do a better job of that myself. And, not, you know, you don't want it to be in the case of a tragedy like this, but just in general, like making sure people are okay when things happen. Um, and so, yeah, like I wanted to talk through some of these ideas and I'll say myths that I've, kind of been trying to wrestle with. This episode obviously is not going to resolve the tension between what feels safe and what isn't. But I'm acknowledging that it's something that I'm wrestling with, and probably many of you are as well. Um, but I think, it's important to remember safety isn't just about locked doors and clear streets, and there's just a lot more to it than that. And so recognizing that, you can't ever be 100% safe, I think the best thing that we can do is just to continue to check on people and, let people know that you're thinking about them, because that matters too. And so hopefully with that, we can create deeper solidarity and a little more empathy in the world. So that was a lot. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. And, if you have thoughts, if you have questions, and look, I get people may feel differently. So if you want to, throw up a different opinion, or, you have something to say, you find me on the socials. There's my website, carljamesspeaks.com. Reach out. But I appreciate you all for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Can I Have a Word?